every time.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Substack Live with me, Dave Keating from Gulf Street Blues.
And I'm Julien Hoez, the editor of the French Dispatch. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for joining us. Yes, busy news afternoon. Of course, we're watching the unfolding images of the hostages being released in Israel. That is amazing news. It's really overwhelming to see the families being reunited. I can't even think about what these people have been through the last 3 years. So I think that's unquestioningly a very good development for the day. But we're here to talk about something very else, very different, which is the unfolding chaos in the French government. It has this. Well, this is the story. Julien, as you know, that's been going on a very long time, but it got very weird over the past week. And it's, I don't know, for outside observers, it is kind of perplexing what's happening right now. When I got the news on Friday that the prime minister had just resigned was being appointed again, it's very confusing for a non-French person. So I'm very privileged to have a French person explain it to me today. So Julia, maybe we'll just back up here because I imagine most of our viewers know the latest developments, but why is this happening? Why have we been through 5, 6 French prime ministers in this current term of Emmanuel Macron?
Well, so yeah, thanks. And it's as confusing for French people as it is for everybody else, because to be honest, at this stage, we've hit the year and a half mark of a complete political gridlock, basically. So at the origin of this is when Emmanuel Macron's party, Renaissance, had a very, very, very bad showing in the 2024 European elections, and the far right came first. Emmanuel Macron took the decision that lots of people said was terrible, and myself, as a party member, I think it was boneheaded, to call early legislative elections because he believed that there's two ideas. Either he wanted to reinforce his majority or reduce that of the far right who had just won a big election, or he just wanted to say, you know what, deal with this yourself, have at it. And this led to a situation where 3 blocks were elected. So you've got the left, the center, and the far right. And basically what's happened is we're in a situation that has never really been seen in French politics before, due in part to the fact that French political parties have become more diverse, in which nobody can control a majority. Everybody's put down red lines, everybody's fighting, and we've reached a stage where people simply aren't able to come to an agreement politically. Which is why we've seen Barnier go down. We saw Bayrou go down after successfully having won budget. And we saw Lecornu basically throw in the towel and resign last Monday before being renominated and now trying again, which will probably not last further than Wednesday. I will say right now.
And the purpose is just so he can put forward this budget, right? Because you need a prime minister in office to put forward the budget, and they have the deadline of, I think, today in order for the budget to be approved, the 2026 budget to be approved by the end of the year. Is that right?
Yeah, so the way it works is that the parliament needs around 70 days to be able to study a budget law. And the problem that we've had is that this was supposed to be presented on the first Tuesday of October, which was last week. And the problem was that there was no prime minister. Everybody was fighting over it. People have kept their red lines. And so, according to what we're hearing, the Council of Ministers will meet tomorrow. The budget will be presented tomorrow based on what was submitted to the High Council of Legislative something, I've forgotten the name, on the 2nd of October. And then the process is going to start. Because, fun facts, because a budget was already sent last week, or 2 weeks ago now, I think, the reality is that they no longer have the time to send another budget in. So all of the work is going to be done in committee, in the Assemblée, and it's just going to become a big, big negotiation between everybody if it gets past Wednesday.
And so we should probably back up and explain why this budget is proving to be so difficult? So the European Union has put France in an excessive deficit procedure. This is a process that was invented back after the financial crisis that basically the EU needed, and Germany demanded in exchange for allowing the ECB to back these countries that were struggling. They needed to invent this budgetary oversight mechanism. Now, France has been in breach of this for years, but the Commission did not, as usual, wanted to give France special treatment, and so didn't actually come out with its finding that France was violating these budget rules until this year, right? So they need to get their deficit in order. The limit for the EU is, I believe, 3%, and France's is somewhere around 6% now.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So they're mandated to deal with this, but all of the budgets that the many prime ministers that have been in place over the past year and a half have been rejected by the parliament, which, as you said, is now split into these blocks. You have the far right bloc rejecting it. You have the far left bloc rejecting it. And there are not enough MPs in the center to get these changes passed. And so basically the arithmetic just doesn't work. Now, obviously, the solution that the far right wants, and honestly, from outside, it seems like maybe the only solution is to call another election if you can't possibly form any majority. The problem is, I keep hearing people saying that a new legislative election, would yield the exact same results. Do you also think that is the case?
Yeah. So I put up a polling graphic 2 weeks ago now, a week ago now, detailing what the results of the first round would be. And if I remember correctly, the results would be exactly the same as the last first round election results a year ago. And this is problematic in several ways. So as you say, the target deficit for all member states of the EU is around 3%. Now, France used to be much higher than this roughly 6% it is now, but after years of some budgetary efforts and some efforts to actually improve the French economy, it's come down quite a bit. The problem now is that for it to reach that next stage of solvability, or whatever we call it in the economic world, there needs to be some cuts or a severe increase in budgetary income, which is where the big issue is coming in right now. Because the biggest fight that's stopping any budget or any coalition discussions occurring between the centrists and the center-left is the retirement reform, as well as this Zuckman tax that we keep hearing about and people keep talking about, which is a 2% tax on people earning above something in the regions of several millions of euros or something, which itself is not a big deal, but has become problematic because of the fact that it also would apply to businesses depending on what they actually own as businesses, in terms of, like, for example, if you earned 9.99 hundreds of thousands of euros and you bought a printer, everything above that get taxed at 2%. And it's a situation where there's ways of negotiating about this, but nobody wants to. There's ways of finding solutions out in the situation, but nobody wants to. Precisely because, as you said, people want an election. Now you've got the entirety of the left, you've got the far rights, you've now got Les Républicains, so the center-right, who were in government until 2 days ago, or until last week when their leader threw a tantrum, also wants an election. And on top of that, you've got the additional demand from the far left and the far right for Emmanuel Macron to be destituted and thrown out, which helps nobody, helps nothing, and doesn't actually change the mechanism of the political situation right now at all. Which is what's making this really difficult for political experts like myself who are studying France and looking at France. Because the reality is, no matter what happens at this stage, nothing changes. You get rid of Macron, you have early presidential elections. The most likely person to win now is Macron's former ally who just threw him under a bus, Edouard Philippe, the former prime minister, who only wants to have early elections now because he's likely to win. That's still a centrist, it's still a liberal. It's a liberal who's further to the right than Macron, but things get worse. legislative elections, exactly the same breakdown, exactly the same problems. We end up in the same situation. And this is the really sad thing about the situation right now. And the sad thing for Europe, which we can get onto in a second, is that we've basically got a political class who are behaving like toddlers, throwing the toys out of the pram, demanding only what they want and refusing any compromise. And it's reached a stage where we can't function as a state right now. And when the inevitable happens, when we can't have a budget, when we don't have the things in place and we haven't met the legal requirements, then whatever government exists in December, or the president or whoever, will end up having to create a budget through ordonnance, which is then going to create another political crisis or add to the shit show that we're seeing right now. Because then they're just going to say, oh, Macron's a totalitarian dictator, he's worse than Vladimir Putin, blah, 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 you know? And it's just childish nonsense at this stage. And French people in the polls, in Vox Pops that you see, they're just sick and tired of this nonsense. And the really problematic thing is the longer this goes on, the more likely they are to vote for the far right, because the thing we hear quite often, we haven't tried them before. Maybe things will be different. Maybe they'll be better, which is bullshit, obviously. And yet that's likely to happen.
And if they just look a little north to the Netherlands, they would see that actually it's not better. When you had the far right in the Netherlands as the largest party in the Dutch parliament and the largest party in the coalition government, things still fell apart. It was exactly the same immature behavior and refusal to compromise. What I've been struck by the fact that when the far right calls for a new presidential election, and some other characters are calling for it, it's so nakedly self-interested because it doesn't actually solve the problem. We should explain that France has a semi-presidential system, like the United States. So the legislature and the president are two separate things. That's unusual in Europe. Usually Europe has parliamentary democracies with it, where the prime minister is the full head of government. In France, that's different. The way that the Fifth Republic was set up was that you would almost always have the legislature in the control of the same party that the president is from. And that has been the case for Macron until he called this election last year. And that's why this is so unprecedented in French politics. And that's also why there's two different options here. There's the calling a new legislative election or calling a new presidential election. I think it would be unusual to call a new presidential election without a legislative election. So it's probably either both or just the legislative election. But you're right that the presidential election still seems very, very unlikely because it doesn't actually do anything to solve the situation, and it only introduces more chaos, right?
And on top of that, let's be fair, Macron's not going to retire. He's not going to give in to people that he's been fighting with for 7 years now.
But he can't run again, right?
He can't run again, so you can only have 2 consecutive terms, but I don't think we have the same thing as in the US where you can only do 2 terms. Technically, Macron can sit it out for 5 years and then run again in 2032.
Or if there's another snap election, we can sit it out for 6 months.
Yeah, exactly. At this stage, to be honest, what do we even know?
But because I wasn't sure if that term limit still applies if you called a snap election and you haven't filled out your whole term.
I think it does. So it only talks about the actual quinquennat or the septennat, whatever the mandates are in the Constitution. It's just 2 successive mandates, and then you have to sit out for a third, and then you can come back. And to be honest, as a quick history lesson to explain just where the mentality behind the Fifth Republic comes from. So, funnily enough, a lot of this is down to the fact that Charles de Gaulle was sick and tired of a parliamentary republic system after World War II. So the great hero of France had single-handedly won World War II on his own, came back, was asked to be president, and basically got run through by parliamentarians who didn't want to listen to him. So he left for a decade and a half, came back, rewrote the constitution for the Fifth Republic, because the Fourth Republic was the same situation, which is why we now have a very top-down and powerful presidency who can ride out some very problematic situations like we're seeing right now. But yeah, and to touch on the far-right situation again, there's another reader and a very bizarre aspect of the fact that the far-right are calling for presidential elections, is that Marine Le Pen can't run.
Right.
And so the plan that they have in their heads right now is if they win elections in if there are legislative elections and they win, and they have a big majority, and they somehow manage to place Bardella as the prime minister, then what they intend to do is to write an amnesty law for Marine Le Pen and potentially Sarkozy, depending on how much he helps them outside of his own prison issues, so that Marine Le Pen can run again in 2027. But this is the really confusing thing, because it doesn't make sense that they're calling for presidential elections when they should be calling for parliamentary elections, unless they don't believe they can legally do so and actually get the legislative law forward, which my 20 euros goes on this amnesty law whenever it's put out, or if it's put out, being blocked by the Constitutional Council.
Mm.
And then
Or
there being another
can Macron
constitutional
veto
crisis.
that amnesty law?
I think technically it's illegal according to the Constitution. Technically. But then it doesn't take much to amend the Constitution either. You need just 2/3 of both the Senate and the Assemblée Nationale. Which is, again, I'm saying all of this and I'm going to nitty-gritty slightly purely because it's really important to outline just how little everybody's behavior makes sense. Because if you really think about it, and if they really think about it, nothing they want to try to do will actually work or happen in any capacity. All we do is we keep spinning our tires and looking foolish on the international stage.
Yeah, let's talk about the international stage implications. By the way, if you guys watching want to put in a question down below, I'll read them out and love to take your questions. There's been, here in Brussels, as you know, a lot of talk about what this means for Europe. We're clearly in a leadership vacuum at the moment in Europe already, even before this latest chaos. Essentially, ever since Macron foolishly called that snap legislative election last year, he has been considered a lame duck here in Brussels. And he's still very visible out there on the international stage. But you can tell within the European Council, he is just not commanding the heft that he used to. And you could see the consequences of that in June, at the European Council Summit in June, where there started to be this consensus vision led by the new German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, that the EU should surrender to Donald Trump for the tariff deals. Up until that point, Macron was kind of leading talks to hit back with retaliatory tariffs and maybe use the anti-coercion trade instrument. But you could see in real time at that June European Council Summit that Macron looked around the room and realized that he himself did not have the political capital to lead this, and that he did not have allies around the room, not even in Ursula von der Leyen, who went very much with the Merz route. So he gave in very quickly. And you can imagine that in an alternative history where he did not call that election last year, I think he might have stuck with his guns, and we might not have had a surrender deal in July were it not for that election.
Yeah.
So the French politics here are very much impacting Europe's strength, particularly when it comes to the threats that are posed by the United States, also the threat that's posed by Russia. And this is very worrying, right? Because this is the EU's second biggest country, aside from the economic concerns about the second biggest Eurozone member, possibly defaulting, needing a bailout. I mean, we can talk about how realistic those scare stories are, but even just politically, this is pretty damaging for the EU, right?
Yeah, and it's part of this issue where people don't understand how much impact this is having. I mean, for example, the reason why Ursula von der Leyen forced through the Mercosur deal, for example, was because of the fact that she realized that she had a big gap because Macron had created such a stupid vacuum for no reason. Like, you remember as much as I do, she went on a clandestine flight over to, I think it was Brazil or something, without announcing it to anybody, and just quickly signed a deal without anybody there, while boycotting all the French events and getting out of the way. It was absolutely outrageous. And on top of this, I think we're also seeing this to some extent across the military scope. So when it comes to the Ukraine situation, Macron can't apply his weight as much as he could before in terms of sanctions against Russia and sanctions against Hungary and Slovakia, for example. On top of this, you also have the issue where, like you say, the response to Donald Trump was quite bad. So Macron luckily has a semi-good relationship with Trump and can sort of manage to work through that. But let's face it, the pro-Europeans in the council, and I mean the big pro-Europeans, don't have power anymore. I mean, you have Macron who's down. Sanchez is fighting for his political life right now. You have I forgot his name, the former military prime minister of Czechia, I want to say.
This Babiš in Czechia.
Yeah, was it Babiš or
the former military guy is the president actually, but the prime minister is Babiš.
Yeah, so the president. Babiš. And it's like we have all these pro-European military, let's say progressive leaders who have now suddenly lost any political power. And the leaders at the European level right now are arguably Merz, Tusk, and Meloni.
Meloni, yeah.
And
Tusk, of course, has his own problems now with the Polish presidency going to the far right. Is, the Polish president isn't the one who comes to the council. He's not the head of government, but he's still causing a lot of problems for Tusk domestically. So it's the same situation. Actually, for all of these leaders, except Meloni, they're all very distracted by a worsening domestic political situation at home. Merz is now dealing with the far-right AfD polling at #1 in Germany. His government is already being criticized for not really having done anything, for being sluggish. So he's completely distracted by domestic issues. Macron's completely distracted by domestic issues. Tusk is completely distracted by his president now trying to veto everything that his government wants to do. The only one who has political capital right now is Giorgia Meloni. Yeah. But what's interesting to me is she's not using it. She doesn't really do much. Despite being, I think, Europe's most popular prime minister at the moment in her own country, she is not really having much of an aggressive agenda in Italy domestically or on the European stage. So she's just kind of treading water now. And I actually don't know what her intention is, because she's actually been not one of the most obsequious Trump flatterers. Interesting. I mean, I think we've seen more nauseating Trump flattery from Keir Starmer than we saw from Giorgia Meloni so far. Yeah. Probably Giorgia Meloni feels she's secure enough that she doesn't need to do it. But what's her game? I don't know what does she want to use her political capital for? I still don't know.
So I think that Meloni's in this odd space where I think she knows that she's safe purely because she's further to the right than most other people in Europe. So the Trumpists will leave her alone and just support her blindly anyway, right? It's one of these weird things where the Americans will back up Farage, what's her face from the AfD, the guys from Vox, Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella, Meloni, purely by fact that they're linked to Trump in some way, shape, or form. And I think that Meloni, she's also got some distractions at home as well, because I think she knows that she's one bad decision away from a schism in her party, because her party is not secure in general. Yeah. But I mean, I think there's one important thing that we should actually talk about right now in light of this weird PR-focused incursion by Russian soldiers onto this road in Finland, right? In that people forget sometimes, and I think that it's important to remind them regularly, that the Russians actively manipulate our information space and our elections and our political systems in Europe because they want to undermine what we're doing and how it functions. It's why we keep seeing all of these far-right actors who are being funded by Russia or being supported by Russia or getting clandestine money by Russia, etc., etc., etc. And I think there's something to be said about the fact that after 3 years of supporting Ukraine, we are now at a stage where Russia's now starting to run out of time because its oil reserves are suffering, its economy is overheated beyond several points where it should be. And on top of that, they're now realizing that you can't always try to manipulate your election results in smaller countries, and they're going quite aggressively against France. You've got the owner of Telegram or Signal or whatever who's actively telling people that Macron and the security services are spying on them and forcing him to spy on them for him. You've got the AfD complaining about the fact that you've got these people, the deep state attacking them. You've got Elon Musk constantly, aggressively trying to dismantle any sort of securities that we have in Europe. And I think it's important for everybody to be aware of the fact that the instability in states like France or the Netherlands or the UK or wherever is actively playing into the hands of a lot of these enemies of ours who want to actually break apart the European Union, right?
Mm.
Yeah, I don't think we hammer this home quite often enough when we're actually speaking about this to people who are outside of our bubble and who aren't necessarily the most aggressively political as people like you and me, or for example.
Yeah, because I think people talk a lot about Russian interference and Russian propaganda, but they don't actually understand what the point is. The point is to create exactly what's happened. I mean, the point is to create instability, to boost smaller parties, whether they're on the far right or the far left, to spread conspiracies. It is to break the hold of the center and to kind of create a chaos through supporting
Yeah.
all of these extremes. And that's not to say that the center is perfect and shouldn't be
Oh,
criticized,
absolutely
because I
not.
think both
Yeah.
of us don't feel that way. But it's an artificial boosting of the criticisms that are not relevant or that are not valid. Interesting point that just came in from George watching. Again, we're reading your comments as they come in, so please keep them coming. So George said, everybody criticized Macron for the snap election, but let's be honest, his party got 2.5 less than Renew. Sorry, not Renew, Rassemblement National. I think his major mistake was that he didn't name a prime minister from the coalition that won the snap election. I think that's a good point, because you've written about this, that he lost an opportunity window at first, because actually when he called that election, here in Brussels, we were all assuming that the far right was going to win, and they
Mm.
didn't win. Actually, it was the left coalition that won that snap election. The problem was they didn't win it by enough to actually
Yeah.
have a governing majority. But it's true that RN came much lower than people were predicting. But how much of the current chaos do you think could have been avoided if Macron had appointed a prime minister from the left early on?
So I mean, I'll come back to this point made about the results because I'm not sure that's entirely correct. But so if Emmanuel Macron had just gone, look, no, we can't form a government on our own. We should nominate someone on the left, someone from the PS to be able to try to form a government. Now, the problem with this is that the left didn't have a majority either. And the left, at the time, it was still being obsessively bullied and controlled by La France Insoumise, so the far left party by a good non-communist called Jean-Luc Mélenchon, one of my favorite people in the world, as you can tell. And they said they didn't want to work with anybody. They weren't going to work with the right. They weren't going to work with the center. They were going to have a pure left-wing government governing based on their manifesto that had only won, if I check, 25.8% of the vote in the second round. And the reality is that there were options, I think, toward the end of last year or just after Michel Barnier's government came down like a sack of bricks, where he could have said, look, we should nominate Olivier Faure. Faure, go for it, figure it out. Because I think if he had nominated a socialist prime minister and that prime minister didn't collapse and didn't function and the government didn't work, he would have had more room for maneuver in nominating a social liberal from the center to be able to do something and say, look, this didn't work, let's try something else. The problem, and this is something just very quick, so he did suggest several socialist or socialist adjacent prime ministers, but the problem was that the far left only wanted someone who was linked to their movement itself, which is where the problem came. And this is where a lot of the issues arose. And this is why you'll notice sometime in September, October, you'll see that the stories and the analysis I was doing was speaking more and more about Olivier Faure, the leader of the socialists, breaking away from La France Insoumise because he realized that this isn't working anymore, right? Now, just very quickly, I don't know, what was the comment? It was 2.5%, the person said, right?
I think 2.5 compared to the European Parliament election, I think is his point.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at
Oh, no, it was a
Macron's
lot less.
bloc did much better in the national election than they did in the European Parliament election. But
Yeah.
in the end, it kind of didn't matter because they'd still lost their majority.
Yeah,
So,
and just as a quick point, so we got 15% less of the votes than the RN, so Renew, I mean, or some, sorry. And in the legislative elections in the second round, the Rassemblement National got 32.05, and Ensemble pour la République, so Macron's bloc, got 24.53, so it was still 7% less, right?
Hmm.
So I don't think it's as close as people are saying or believe it was. It was still a bad loss in general.
But not as bad as the European Parliament election, I
Oh, no,
guess.
that
But
was catastrophic.
that was kind of a given. I mean, I guess the gamble by Macron at that point was people tend to use the European Parliament votes as protest votes, which is a big problem for the EU elections. And so I think his gamble was, already, I think it was the third election where Front National / Rassemblement National came first. They definitely came first in 2014. I think
2019 as well.
Yeah, 2019. So yeah, that's three. So it wasn't actually that unusual that the far right came first. And also actually in the UK, the far right came first in 2014. So it's that itself wasn't that unusual.
Yeah.
But I think the consensus now is that he had an overreaction. Well, who knows? Maybe he thought something else would happen, but it seems like he had an overreaction to the European Parliament election result, even though it wasn't actually that unusual and is usually not a good indicator of how national elections are going to go. But he thought that he could call the French public's bluff, basically. Like, you're willing to throw your vote away for the European Parliament. You wouldn't do this for a national election. To an extent, I guess he was right, because they didn't do as well in the national election as in the Parliament election, but it wasn't to the extent that he probably thought.
Yeah, and there's also one very important point to say, is that there was a very interesting dynamic in the European elections, which is why it doesn't make sense that Macron overreacted to such an extent. Because the Renaissance campaign was one of the worst that many of us have seen in French politics in decades. I mean, this was a complete and utter mess. So they threw Valérie Hayé to the wolves. There was this really weird dynamic because I've worked with Valérie Hayé in the past. I know what she's like. I know that she's a good politician. She's a good communicator. There was this really awkward thing that kept happening where every time she turned up at an event or every time she was on television, out of nowhere, a presenter would randomly say, "Oh, and we have a visitor for you. Ha ha ha, it's the Prime Minister." And so the Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal, would turn up at her events and just take over randomly when she's in the middle of a photo. And it got so bad at one point that I know a lot of members of the party who actually voted for Raphael Glucksmann's list because the campaign was such a disaster.
Oh.
I mean, it was an absolute catastrophe. And this is why Glucksmann got plus X 6% or something, is because a lot of the Macron votes went to the PS because Glucksmann was arguably the closest thing to having a program and being close to Macron's movement. And so the party knew this was happening. The Élysée definitely knew this was happening. But at one point, they pulled Attal and told him to stop getting involved in Hayé's events. And so the overreaction doesn't even make sense. Like, it was just ridiculous nonsense. It was silly, quite honestly.
Well, maybe we'll wrap up by just talking about what's next. So you mentioned that there's going to be this meeting of the council tomorrow, and then they will move forward on, they have to move forward on the existing budget from October 2nd because it's too late to put a new one down. And the idea will be to adjust this budget within the parliamentary committees. How likely do you think it is that we have a 2026 budget in place by December 31st?
So I think there will be a budget. Whether it's done through the normal parliamentary procedure or not is the actual key question right now. And this is really the issue. So already, rather than sticking to 4.7% of deficit, they've just said, look, we're keeping it under 5% to for now, which means they have 9 billion euros more to play with, which isn't pocket change. It's quite a substantial amount of money when you're talking about a lot of the initiatives being put forward. The problem that we have right now is that Emmanuel Macron, Lecornu's government, you've already got promises of censure from the far left, the communists, the ecologists, the far right, all of the far right parties, a big portion of the socialists, a big portion of the Républicains. And so I don't know how this really happens because the socialists have said, we will support you if you immediately and completely suspend the 2023 pension reforms. Now, it's possible that they'll suspend it temporarily pending a discussion. But then all that happens at that stage, and the parliamentarians from Renaissance will know that all this means is that later on down the line, you'll have the socialists say, if you don't do this, we censure your government immediately. If you then don't do this in 7 months, we're going to do it again and again and again. And I don't think either Macron or Lecornu or whoever is very comfortable being held hostage. So what I see happen, there's 2 routes. Either Lecornu's government is censured sometime this week or next, or there's 3 routes, sorry. Because he also said he'll resign again if he feels that there's no way to actually do what he's trying to do. Or the more positive idea is that Lecornu somehow manages to get a budget in place, and then snap elections are called, because otherwise it's going to be exactly the same thing in 7 to 8 months. So really, there will be a budget, because there has to be. The government doesn't function with it, and there's several mechanisms to make sure there's a budget anyway. But whether it's what they're proposing now or not is the big issue. And to be honest, anybody who tells you they know exactly what's going to happen is lying. I lean towards the idea that the government will fall. But beyond that, I don't think anybody can tell you whether there'll be a budget or not, because there will be one, but this budget is likely not the one that's going to go through.
If the government falls, what happens next?
You're probably going to end up with a rollover government done through ordonnance or through executive action, sorry. And then that will be done at the same time as elections are called. So there's a procedure where Macron has to speak with the head of the Assemblée Nationale and the Senate to tell them, look, there's probably going to be elections at some point soon. Get ready. And he had that meeting last week, according to everything we know. So if this doesn't work, then Macron would dissolve it and just go for it. And that will be it. And so this is really the question.
It's the last chance, essentially, right?
Pretty much. Yeah.
Well, we'll see what happens, but thanks so much for walking me through that, especially because I find this back and forth very confusing, especially with the budget stuff. So it's very useful to have your insights on that. Thank you all for joining for this discussion. I will link below to some of the Julien's pieces about this, so you can get more detail, all the detail you want about this unfolding situation. And I'm sure he's going to keep doing a great job keeping us abreast of what's happening over there in Paris with a Brussels perspective. So thanks so much, everybody, for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.